I'm Sebastian over these two. My colleague Lou Bernard can't be here today. The reason we're here is that we form part of the, we have two members of the Technical Council of the Text Encoding Initiative, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute if you're not familiar with it. This is a bit of a holiday for me. My normal day job is at Oxford University as a Director of Academic IT. So forgive me if my nerdiness is a little bit rusty, but don't worry, I could be nerdier than any of you about the TEI. So, to remind you, those of you who are not familiar with what this is, it's a project going back 25 years to define guidelines for text encoding. So we're talking here about digitization of existing text. So it's very different from what most of you in the room will be doing, I think. And when we say digital text, this isn't just 19th century novels. I know where the Google Books think that the world started in about 1900 and that it mostly consists of novels, and in the same way that Apple thinks that all music consists of something they call albums with artists and tracks in it. They're both wrong. The history of the book obviously goes back much further than that, and we're talking here about not just books, but manuscripts as well. So any kind of written material, and that might include dictionaries, it might include transcribed spoken text, facsimiles of books, as well as the 19th century novels like editions of Jane Austen. It defines a very rich language. There are about 550 elements and 220 modules, and we'll see why that's a problem in a minute, and it gets to the basis of my talk, with a complex infrastructure of model and attribute classes. It's designed to do very deep encoding. It's not really designed for modern writing, though to add entertainment at the end of your day, I will shortly show you how to render TEI XML using Saxon CE to show that I have to be paying attention during the conference. There are obviously some specialist vocabularies, and particularly MathML and SVG, which the schema does not attempt to replicate, so those will be included, but I won't mention that again. So the domain of the TEI is this type of stuff. Things like a conventional 18th century book here, but which may have quite complex typography, like nasty tables there, if you can see it, if you have very good eyes, been practicing from the demo jam last night, little bits like that, complex title pages, but also non-paper text-bearing objects like this gravestone here, First World War gravestone, or manuscripts like that fragment of Beowulf up the top there, which started the English language, and intermediate things like this diary from the late 18th century. And manuscripts, I forget what this is of, where we have the original author's manuscript, and you can see that for study their writing process. So the people who study this kind of thing are not necessarily interested in the text per se, but the textual the history of composing the text. So did he write, or she, write the red stuff in between the interlinear stuff first, or scrub it all out with green and write all over it? What order did the blue stuff come in? Can you tell? If you're trying to reconstruct how a poet arrived at his final work, this is very interesting to you. So the job of the TEI is to impose a layer of XML markup on top of that, which describes those phenomena. So again, if you have very good eyesight, you will see markup there, which is trying to represent this sort of thing. It's talking about it as an object with lines on the page, in this case without attempting to interpret what those lines might mean, whether they're lines of prose or poetry. The TEI manifesto, I contrast this with Ditto, a doc book, which you might be familiar with. It's a descriptive DTD. Sorry, I have to say DTD from habit of 20 years ago. It's a descriptive schema. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you how to do things. It provides many different ways of describing many and varied phenomena. It's trying to be technology agnostic. So say it started 25 years ago, it's been through SGML and XML and DTDs and relaxing schemas and things like that. It wants to be around in another 25, 50 years. And what I'm talking about today is some of the measures taken to try and distance ourselves from current technology. It's modelled as independently as possible, although it currently uses relaxing to define its content model. That's what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about. The most important thing is the last one, and this is where it will differ from your favourite DTD. A project using this is actively encouraged to develop their own subset of it, to define their own profile of it, where they will pick out just the bits that describe the problem they're dealing with, and add their own extra constraints that are specific to their discipline or their project. That's where the entertainment comes in. I was doing this I was finishing this yesterday morning. and then talk about Saxon C came in, and I thought, hang on a minute, I've written this in XML. I could and I render it to this form here to get PDF by turning it into LaTeX and then generating PDF from there. And I thought, why don't I render it into HTML? Well, I'm here, and look, there's a way of doing it in the browser. So let's first of all have a look at that. If we fire up my browser in here and refresh this, we will see that the promise of what we saw yesterday is that that sort of works. It's a little bit slow on here. Loading up the skeleton HTML file, which loads in the XML file and an associated XSL, and when it gets around to it, the person from Saxonica has got his fingers crossed at the moment, saying, I promised it worked on tablets. It will work eventually. I don't really understand why there's a considerable delay here, because when the thing is loaded, it's perfectly speedy. Okay, it does something there, and look, there's my talk all over again, and the bit we're reading is that bit there. So it duly works, and I thought, why stop there? I thought, well, you know, what's HTML if not, what's EPUB if not HTML? So if I've got this working to HTML, let's have a look at an EPUB instead. So you'll forgive me the collection of Biggles books, now you know my dirty secret. Bloody good Biggles.
What's all?
This is Apple letting me down with not getting on with it. Well, that's interesting. I can see something in the Chrome. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so it duly works in EPUB as well. You can see the table of contents, and you can look ahead and get excited about what I'm going to tell you in 5 minutes' time. Back to that bit. Then I thought, well, hang on a minute. We're all into reuse of differentiation between content and formatting here. So why not go a little bit further, and this time I'll turn it into Word instead. So if I find here my copy of the ghastly pages on an iPad, you'll see the same document again. Apologies for Mr. Apple's slowness. You'll see the same document here again, this time rendered as a sequential Word document. You have to take my word for it. This is a docx file. I take no credit for managing to show the same graphic, but the text obviously being done properly in there. And then when I was getting bored this afternoon, or not bored, stimulated by the people talking about RDF, I thought, hey, what does the RDF look like from this? So I did the transformation into RDF as well, which is one of these. So I did my standard extraction to RDF triples here, and saw what I ended up with. And you can see some things coming out of there, that there is an assertion here in RDF XML that there was a document here which had some actions of creation, and they were created by people who were actors in that act of creation. And this is using the ontology of CRM. But that was, I wouldn't suggest that anybody looked at that very closely. There's not a great deal of content in this document. So that's what the TEI is, and you'll be surprised to know, not surprised to know, that the guidelines, the schemas, are built using a literate programming system, again going back 20 years. So we don't have a schema, we don't write a DTD, we don't write a relaxing a W3C schema, we write something in the TEI which describes a schema. So there is a set of TEI elements which describe elements and attributes. Include the descriptions, their documentation, it includes the examples, it includes content models, data types and so on, pointers to information about how it can be used, some constraints on it, like business models if you like, and equivalences. So where a TEI representation of a person element, is known to be directly comparable to the same concept of an E21 person in CRM, that's recorded back at source, so you can derive the RDF that we just saw. So 20 years ago, this is what it looked like. This is a bit of SGML with a markup talking about tag docs and exemplums and things like that. Don't look at that one. Look at this one, which is how we do it now. So this is where you would have in your relaxing compact schema a thing saying, this is talking about an element called resp statement. You would say resp statement equals A bar B brackets star around it. Instead, we have this bunch of nonsense here, talking about the fact there is an element called resp statement. It occurs within it's unnerving, isn't it, being tweeted at? So, it occurs within a particular model. It has a description in different languages. I just, for the sake of space here, I've omitted all of the Italian translation of it. You have the translations of all these elements into 6 languages. A little section about classes. What clubs is it a member of is a way of expressing it. And these clubs may determine whose other content models it may appear in, or which attributes it may pick up. It's a similar concept as you would model in DTDs and schemas, obviously. But the point of it is being explicit in the TEI's own language here. Then the body of it here is written in relaxing, talking about one or more pointing to another concept. And there's an example down here, and I've missed out other possible examples. And again, I've just put in the French example here. We would maintain examples in as many languages as possible so that we can generate different language versions of the guideline. You use the same language to define a customization. So what you see here is a view of the TEI, is defining a view of the TEI written in the TEI odd language, which says, I am going to define my schema, which is based on the TEI, so third line down, source. That tells you where to read the source of the TEI, so you may base your particular working schema on an old release of the TEI to tie it to a particular release. You go into a series of module ref elements, which are shorthands for picking up a bunch of related elements. So we want core and header and text structure to pick up normal things. We want, about 7 lines down, names and dates, but we only want a couple of elements for it. We only want 2 elements out of there. We want all of the one called figures, except the element called formula. And in this stanza here, we say, when I talk about the title element, it's that pretty obvious element within the TEI, I want to change it. So I include it in change mode. Mode equals change there. And what I actually do is replace one of the attributes within an at list wrapper, which says that the type attribute, I wish to say that its occurrence I want to change, that it must occur at least once, and it can occur as many times as you like, and it can have these possible values. So I provide a set of fixed values that it can pick up. It's not rocket science to give people a way to do it, and you could do all this with the standard schema languages. But this is the very essence of the TEI, that we expect people to do this. It's not something that we expect each individual project to do it. If you're encoding the works of Shakespeare and you have decided on a set of guidelines with your supplier or your graduate students or children, whoever's going to do all the typing for you, this is where you write down the rules. So you make explicit the assumptions, the limitations that you're imposing on yourself. There's a free-form type attribute in the TEI, which who knows what people might use it for. This project is guaranteeing that these are the values it's going to use. And from all of this, you will derive a conventional schema. So a little trivial diagram here showing how this might work. So you would take your document that we wrote just there, think about odd customization. You would pull in the TEI source. From that, you would derive your modified subset of the TEI, the patched version of it, if you like. And from that, you would derive the different schema types. And this does tell the truth in that it says, if you want to get W3C schema, you would first generate relaxing, and from there you would generate W3C with Trang. Or you might generate DTD directly, you might generate some schematron rules, or you might generate the documentation with all that material laid out nicely for you according to your language as chosen, from which you might generate output forms like Word or EPUB or LaTeX, from which you might make PDF. You can tell I come from a kind of open source world here. I even have the decency to call it LOXML, pretending that being an international standard means something. So what's the problem with this? Well, apart from the fact that I've stolen this picture from Eric Carl's book without acknowledgement. We're neither one thing nor the other. We have most of a language there for describing the schema, But some of it's written in a foreign language over which we have no control. So it's the content models are written in the relaxing. The data types use W3C data types, which isn't so bad. And semantic constraints are written, I didn't give an example of that, using schematron rules. So there's you can't, that would be okay, except that it permits people to do funny things, and it means we're not in control of it. So one of the answers you might give is, you're barking, you've been doing this 20 years, just stop now and you write normal schemas like normal people and have a file called TEI.rng and another file called the documentation and write that in Ditter and have done with it. That would be one answer. So that's one choice, is to say, well, it's a bit of a mess, but what the hell, people use it, it works. The other thing we could do is we could just give up maintaining this private language and re-express everything in relaxing and use the full power of the language. Because the other problem we have is, because we're modeling our attributes and our elements and our classes in one language and our content models in another language, we're neither independent of relax nor can we use the full power of it. So the last thing we could do, well, that would be good, but then we would be tying ourselves to one technology. So the alternative we describe here is to define the whole schema language in TEI itself. And the only reason why this would be valid if we could show added value from doing so. We do set ourselves a constraint here that we would support the intersection of the common schema languages. So that effectively means no interleave, and there must be deterministic, so that you can make DTDs. And following the XML constraint of space only being permitted within that common pattern. This turns out to be surprisingly easy, and before you write down a note saying ask him a question, I'll come up with the questions you're going to ask in a minute. I simply add two extra elements called sequence and alternate to define either a sequence of things or a choice between them. And we add a couple of attributes, min occurs and max occurs, which we add on any pointing element. So when we point to explicitly an element, a class, or a macro, I don't like quite what word macro, but just think about classes, groups of elements, or particular elements, we can specify their minimum maximum occurrences, where the default for each is 1. So where we used to have, look, it looks exactly the same. We used to have a relaxing pointer to a class of elements called p-like, model.p-like. Now we say class ref key equals model.p-like. And if we want to express the typical kind of models like the one expressed in pseudo DTD above, with B or C star and D plus, it's a series of sequences and alternates. You don't need to stare at this too hard to realize that it's really quite trivial, and it does the job. And that's how you do repeated sequences by adding a max occurs on any of the elements. One extra thing we can do is when we point at a group of elements, a model, where here we point at model.A, model.B, we can say it's taken at the moment. When you say key equals model.A, it's taken to mean you can have any one of the elements within that group. So if that has 3 elements which are in that model, you can have one occurrence of any of them. By adding on max occurs, we can say how many times they can occur. We can add and expand attribute to this to vary the behavior a bit more, to say that it's not, so the simplest case is any member of that group, one of them in any order. By adding an expand attribute on the end, which can have the value sequence optional, sequence repeatable, or sequence optional repeatable, we are constraining further in what way we can use elements from that group. So the second one, sequence optional, if the model had the elements A and B in it, it means they can occur. They don't have to, neither of them have to occur, but if they do occur, they have to occur in a fixed order. Or if it's the third one, they can occur as many times as you like, but again, they have to occur in that order. if we had longer, and I had the right kind of particularly obnoxious person who studies manuscripts here, they could tell you precisely why they want this and why it makes them very angry that the current content models permit you to have elements in any order. And yes, I know it doesn't matter, but they don't know that. This is a way of making people happy. Adding in mixed content, we take the element, the attribute from W3C schema of mixed. So here we have mixed equals true, meaning that these things can have space in between. So you end up with a genuine example here from the old TEI series of RNG, one or more refs, groups, things like that, and what it looks like in the new one, which you could study at your leisure in the proceedings if you wanted to prove to yourself that they are equivalent. Now we have to add added value, because your obvious criticism would be, that's just syntactic sugar for relax, what's the point? We've got to start finding things that we can add on here, so if we have our language under our own control, what can we do extra that we couldn't do before, and buy things in the future? We may not be able to implement them now, but we can at least express them. So for instance, we may say here that we want to limit the number of times something can occur in sequence. So permitting no more than 2 consecutive sequences of all of the members will be difficult for us in our current language. I could spend more time on this, but I won't. Suffice it to say, this thing exists, it does the job, and we have got as far as defining all new elements, changing the processing tools, and proving it against the TEI guidelines that you can actually, it does replicate all the constraints that we had in the old one by generating DTDs and schemas and running all the tests against them. Some of the things left over to do are to look about how you actually, so within the element we have an element called formula, which would be expected to include mathml, how we actually model that in the system, because before we just X-included relaxing. And a piece of work to do is to generate W3C schema directly from this language, removing the current dependency on going via relaxng and using Trang. And those of you who are keen on GitHub can go and check it out from there. And I will be monitoring the downloads after this to see if any of you do. To go beyond this, to the work we haven't done yet, we would want to start thinking about extending the language to incorporate, for instance, interleave. The ability to say that you can have these 2 things, but I don't care what order they're in. It used to be very useful there in SGML and was taken away by XML. So one way we could do this would be to allow, overgenerate from it and mop it up afterwards with schematron. So if you wanted to say A or B or C or D, but only one of those, we don't care which it is, but you have to use one of them, we want to provide a notation for that. And also the situation which W3C has, where we want to have a content model for a particular element differing in depending on the context. So in a metadata context, you can't use things which relate to what an author's crossing out, deletions and additions. It just doesn't make sense in a metadata context, but in a transcriptional context it does. So these are the kind of things we're now starting to experiment with, of the adding in extra bits of the language. So saying, for instance, adding a context attribute to say that this rule only applies with the context of, I'm using XPath notation there, of this first rule only applies if the ancestor is text. How to go about implementing this in practice for the different schema languages, most likely overgenerating and then producing schematron rules which wipe out the thing that is no longer allowed. Another alternative would be to throw away all of the schema generation and rewrite everything as schematron rules. It's something that we now have the freedom to do with our complete language, to re-implement it entirely. We could write the whole thing out as a single bit of XSLT or a schematron at a slightly higher level, or in some other language entirely. So here's the auto-critique to save you making the criticisms of me. One is, just stop all this nonsense, HTML1 a long time ago, to which I would reply that that's just syntactic sugar. You want to say that this particular bit of text, you can't quite read it in the author's manuscript, it's unclear. Whether you say span item prop equals unclear or unclear, it doesn't really help. We are just expressing relaxing in a different language, but by doing so deliberately so that we can give ourselves a platform on which to build. Validation so 20th century, I think, has been expressed a couple of times during this weekend. It's difficult to say to an encoding project, don't do any validation. That would be ridiculous to say you have no quality control. Of course you have to have quality control if you're sending stuff off to large-scale things coming back from the Philippines. How do you check what they've done? You've got the rules written down on a bit of paper. How do you check they've actually done it? When I say you're imposing a bottleneck in processing, what I'm getting at there is that by writing our own notation, we're cutting ourselves off from the multiple implementations we would have if we only wrote something in a schema language. If I just wrote W3C schema, there are several independent good tools I could use. By going this way, everything gets filtered through tools that inevitably only we will maintain. So it's a little bit, there's a danger there that if we don't pick up more users of it or more support for it, we cut ourselves off from future development. So conclusions? Was it worth it? Was it worth my while coming here to give this paper? Yes, I convinced myself more and more as I realised I was coming to talk about it. Principally because of that crucial point that in this case, unlike many of the schemas you will use, we expect humans to read it. We expect them to understand what it means. We expect them to define their own constraints. We want to make it as easy as possible to use a single language in which they cannot contradict themselves and do things in different ways. And it gives us a platform on which we can build more and more semantic rules. This project going back 25 years has got masses of prose in it which recommends how to do things. And there are lots of occasions where it says, you really shouldn't do this, but you can actually do it. It wouldn't be contradicted by the schema. And we want to take more and more of that prose and put it in a form where it can be checked. And lastly, of course, the TEI is positioning itself, well, since it's the last talk, to be free of XML. So when XML dies in 10, 20, 50 years' time, we want a language, I know it's written in XML, on which we can build for the next generation. So my concluding argument is that by doing this, by having an extensible independent notation for expressing our semantic constraints, we're taking the TEI back to its roots in the late 1980s and finally meeting its design goal of not being dependent on a particular technology. And that's my lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah, that last point is really interesting. TEI is positioning itself to be free of XML. I mean, this is one of the problems with XML today, is that when you choose XML, you are saying, I don't want my programming language to own the data. In fact, I don't want anyone to own the data. I'm putting it in XML. And now you're saying, I want to do that again in TEI. Why the move away from XML? Is that
not particularly, no. It's just in case something good comes along, I would be more prepared for it than somebody who's slaved away writing, maintaining DTD by hand. I don't read too much into it. We actually have any agenda, no. But be aware, the word overlap was mentioned yesterday. There are also people in this world who are much more obsessed, for instance, by overlapping hierarchies than most of you are. And there are languages proposed which would deal with that. So if they got more traction, then we might like to re-express it in there. So it's not a ridiculous possibility.
Tom?
You transformed straight from your language into DTDs and W3 schema via Relax NG and Trang.
Yeah.
Is it just historical that you do that and you don't go to DTD through Trang?
I think it was causing problems. I think I was generating relaxing which didn't go to DTD.
And are you going to consider for centralised validation, maybe generating NVDL to pull together several of those technologies, maybe relax with schema?
Oh, we do, yes. I mean, if you, thanks to Georgia there, if you fire up your Oxygen and create a new TEI document, the template thing will pull in an NVDL which pulls in the schematron and the current relaxing schemas. So that's what we expect people to do, yes. We possibly expect people to add new schematron constraints, although this is working towards avoiding the direct writing in schematron, trying to express our own notation for it, which you may say is barking. But you and I are the NVDL lovers in this room. I think we should go around and say, everybody, use NVDL.
Yeah.
NVDL.